So the artwork that you've showed us so far today, it's all been black and white artwork. Obviously comics are published in color. Take me through the production process. How do they get from the black and white pen and ink art that we're looking at to the final color books?
Sure. And so let me walk you through another one of my favorite books. This is Captain America 286. Introduced Deathlock, or reintroduced Deathlock in the 1980s, also drawn by Mike Zeck.
Yep.
So what we'll do is we'll turn to the inside pages, and I actually have an example for the very last page here. So as you can imagine, it started out as, it starts as the artist's drawing this, and here's the black and white page that goes along with this. Here's the 80s, and I think this process was used for the most part almost until modern times, which is they would create what they call a color guide. So let me actually bring out what that looks like here. So this would be, what they would do is they would photocopy the original black and white art. They would then have somebody use what they call Dr. Martin's dyes, which was probably the most common way, but they would basically color the different pages, and then they would, as you'll see these notes here, the reason that they included these is they wouldn't shoot this directly. As you can see, it's not great to shoot off of a photocopy, but they would hand this off to a printer, and the printer would actually make sure that they were actually colorizing the final things, the final images, and then they would actually translate those to printing plates. And so there would be 4 plates. It'd be a red, a yellow, a cyan, and a black. And so they would then translate it. What these referred to is what color, this Y3, it's a certain color yellow that
Color
they would
codes.
use. And so that the printer would then know what they were supposed to actually translate to the printing plates. And so this was used for the majority of comics, at least through the almost at least the 2000s. I think today you see more digital coloring that's going on, but this was sort of the standard way of doing it.
But the printer is essentially interpreting these colors to generate the plates. It's not a photograph of this page or anything like that that's led to this plate.
Exactly. So when you look at a color guide, again, you may notice some differences on this. And it's actually interesting, too. Sometimes you'll find, and I can't remember if this is one of those, but I think actually, yeah, you can see here at the very last part it says, they actually cut off or they whited out some of the wording, and this was actually shot off in an earlier version before it made it to the final edits. So again, the intention was not to shoot this directly for a publication, but to give the printer a sense of what the final colors would look like. But there are sometimes differences even between what you see here and what you see on the color guide.
Interesting.
So, but there's another process that was also used primarily in the 80s and maybe early 90s with some premium type books. And I'll show you an example here. So this was a book, again, done by Mike Zeck of The Punisher, but it was printed in a more deluxe format with much heavier paper. So you can see here, much thicker paper, takes the ink much differently than it did with the regular publications that would come out on the newsstand.
Yeah.
And so here, what they decided to do is they said, look, we actually want to color this and actually shoot the artwork directly so that it actually goes to the printer and is reproduced in the exact same way that we're actually producing the artwork. And so in this case, they started again with the black and white image here, and what you expect to see. But then what they did is they actually created what they call a blue line. And so for this, they made a photocopy of this black and white artwork on acetate as a starter.
Yep.
And the reason it's called a blue line is they would actually print that on the paper as well. And so you can see these blue areas that were actually black. They would actually give this, and so it would be basically a black and white image of this, but it was blue. But it would allow the artist, the painter, to know where they had to color and where they didn't. And then ultimately they would put this acetate on top of it and then shoot it for printing. But this allowed for more complex coloring, where here you had solid colors. Here you can see that there's a bit of a gradated background here.
Yeah.
Same thing on the Punisher's costume, is that this airbrush allowed them to do more gradations and therefore have a more finished look to it. And so sometimes you'll see these blue lines. For Dark Knight Returns, which is a famous Batman story, also done this similar way, and you'll find some other premium books. American Flag, I know, was done this way. But you won't find this for all books as well. And again, usually there's either a color guide or there's a color blue line.
Yeah.
Very rare that you'd find both.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the subtle gradation in the sky there, for example, right? And it's obviously, it's only because they're using this very different printing process in this book. And the type of printing process being used here, they'd never be able to convey.
Yeah, it really
Something
has to
like
do with
that,
the
right?
paper, because they knew that the ink would be absorbed into this, and there's a lot less that they can do. As you can also see,
Yeah.
you know, compared to the original art, you lose a lot of the details. And the reason that they work so large is that they know they're going to lose those details. In a book like this, they didn't expect to lose a lot of detail, and so they could print directly from the artwork itself.
So I assume the color guide is more common than the blue line?
Well, again, for the number of them, yes. The number of comic books that were produced using color guides, many more of those out there than there are for blue lines. And there's only a few books that you'll find blue lines for, but
Yeah.
it could be your favorite book.
Yeah.
So it's important to know the difference.
But to me, this seems like a more interesting piece than the color guide. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think some collectors would say, you know, from a collectability standpoint, you know, the blue lines are great. And you know, here's an example where you could actually frame them up next to each other. It would look very impressive together. Not to say that it wouldn't look impressive to sort of show the process for these two pages as well. But you know, it's all aesthetics. You know, value-wise, you know, the blue lines are probably worth a little bit more. But I think, frankly, compared to the original black and white art, which is what most people collect, you know, this is where most people are going to put their money. This is really, if you know they can't have this, maybe they would want that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And in the best world, have them both.
In the best world, you can have them both. So there are, in this case, as we talked about, there are 2 originals
Sure.
that you can collect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. And any other types of coloring that are used, or this is the 2 main?
Yeah, I
standards?
mean, sometimes you'll actually see for painted covers especially, so I actually do own the cover to this book. This was one large airbrush painting that was done, and so it was shot directly off that. It wasn't using the blue line process. And so a lot of times for the covers, because it's on a heavier cardstock, and even with the old comic books here, these were done on a heavier stock as well. And so this wasn't the typical newsprint that was on inside. It would be glossy.
Slightly
it would have
different.
other things, so that you could potentially do a cover as a painted cover.
Yeah.
And that would be just usually shot off of a painting itself. And so this is an example where they did that.